The bathrooms are located down the hall. If you go out this door, you take a left, and then you take another left at the very first small corridor, and the bathrooms are there. In the unlikely event that there is some sort of emergency that might require evacuation, let me just direct you to the exits. There's one there, there's one right here, and if need be, there's one in the back of the room as well. So those are the exits. As far as our format for this morning, each finalist will introduce himself and respond to an identical set of questions which have been submitted by members of the public via the district's website, as well as questions from you, our audience. If you would like to submit a question, I think everyone has been given some index cards. If not, my friend Dr. Gimartino has some. So just please raise your hand. He'll get a card to you. I think we have some pencils as well, I hope. And if you write down the card and give it to either Ray or me, we'll be happy to get it up to the moderator and ensure that it's asked. There's also some comment cards, and I think you can use the same cards that were handed out for that. There is a box right at the table, at the registration table. It's a clear plastic box, and if you have a comment, and rather than just a question, but you still would like the board to be aware of your view with respect to a particular candidate or issue, please just drop the card off on the way out, and we will make sure that they get into the right hands. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Ms. Shanique Bird.
Hello, everyone. As he said, my name is Shanique Bird, and I will be your moderator for today. So I need to let you know how this will work. Okay. So we'll have pre-selected questions, and then we'll have questions from you. So we'll rotate questions, okay? So each candidate will have roughly 90 seconds to answer each question, okay? All right. So we're going to have Thomas Green. Sorry. We're going to have Eric Thomas with us. Good afternoon, Eric. How are you?
Terrific.
Okay. So we're going to start with a question, okay? How do you plan to improve the graduation rate of African American males?
First of all, I really want to thank everyone for sharing their Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, to be a part of this conversation. I really do appreciate it. I've spent a couple days here, actually 3 days. I arrived on Thursday and had an opportunity to sort of engage with many people over the past 2 or 3 days, so I really appreciate that. Before I answer that specific question, I think there was a question around, just sort of a broad question, around what makes me, either through my personal experiences or my professional experiences, a really excellent candidate for this position. So what I'd like to do is sort of take that question on, and with that I actually have, and unfortunately I have to stand just a little bit. I actually have a little bit of a presentation. And I think the presentation will give you a little background on who Eric Thomas is and sort of what's important to me. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Taken, but it's actually one of my favorite movies. In Taken, the scene is Liam Neeson, who has this special set of skills, if you remember that line, and his daughter has been taken. And what resonates with me in this movie, there's two pieces. There's a level of urgency that he provides, and he reaches out for help. I think that's where Rochester is at the moment. Again, if you know the movie a little bit, he finds out that his daughter's been taken. He immediately calls several friends to get help. Now, he himself is really talented. He has an incredible amount of skills himself, but despite the skills that he has, he knows that he needs help. I think that's where the district is now. How do we bring everybody into the fold? The other thing that resonates with me is the level of urgency. Here's what I'm going to ask that you imagine for a second. Imagine finding out that your child was on the West Coast and he or she was in trouble. That your child was on the West Coast and he or she was in a life or death situation. What would you do? For most of us, the answer is anything. We would do just about anything that we needed to do to save our child. I think that's another situation in which Rochester City Schools is at a pivotal point that we've got 25,000 students. In fact, let's call it another 5,000, because my vision is to bring another 5,000 back. 10 years ago, this district was much larger than where it is today. In this broader community, we've got another 5,000 students that should be attending our schools. The level of urgency in Taken makes it very clear we're going to save our kids' lives, because without a strong educational experience, whether we say literally or figuratively, our kids are dying. And we as the adults in this community have to make sure that that's not going to take place. Let me just walk through a couple things with you. And again, this is just to give you a little background about Eric. On the left, that's the house I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. We moved to Cincinnati when I was about 10 years old, and that's the housing project I grew up in Cincinnati. I spent the next 38 years in Cincinnati. If you look at some of my background, it seems to suggest that I'm from the South. I was born in Georgia, but I've actually spent 38 years living in Ohio, and got many relatives in Northeast Ohio, Cleveland area, and spent a lot of time in the Cleveland area. I simply share this because that's who Eric is. If you start thinking about all of those at-risk indicators that we sometimes talk about, single parent, check it off. Wrong zip code, check it off. Household income, maybe not where we want it to be, check it off. African American male, check it off. So all of those indicators that we sometimes suggest is going to impact someone's future, I can check them all off. Despite that, because of an incredible mother who made us understand, myself and my two siblings, that education was going to be the anchor and the driver. My entire professional career, my goal has simply been to give kids an opportunity to achieve what I have achieved. From a professional standpoint, and I'm not going to walk through all of these pieces, as I shared, most of my time was actually in Cincinnati. I taught in Cincinnati, a high school teacher, social studies. I was an administrator in Cincinnati. You can see a little bit, about some of my experiences in Cincinnati. What I really want to highlight about Cincinnati is that Cincinnati was very similar to Rochester. About the same number of students. When I left, we're about 30,000 students. Since I left, they've gained about 5,000. And I'm convinced that some of the things that we did before I left laid the foundation to increase that enrollment. And I'm really excited about that. What I'm also really excited about.
Excuse us, sir. No, we have that in here today. We are. No, we're not having that in here today. Yes, we are. No, we're not having that in here today. Be quiet, Commissioner. We're not having that in here today. Sir, we're parents and community members. No, we're going to do this correctly, Howard. We're going to do this correctly, Howard.
Here's what I can share. Cincinnati Public Schools was in a very similar situation as Rochester. In Ohio, there's an A to F rating. Cincinnati Public Schools had an F rating. Over the course of 6 to 7 years, as a part of the work that I led, we went from an F to a D to a C, and became a B district for 2 consecutive years. We were the highest performing urban school district in the state of Ohio. Very similar demographics, very similar size. What I will also say, and again, I don't know all of the different contextual pieces about what's going on here, but here's what I can say. The individuals there want to see this school district advance. We can debate about their process. We can debate about whether this is the right setting and the right forum to have that sort of conversation. We can have that debate. But one of the reasons that I was really excited about Rochester, can continue to be even more excited about Rochester, is the eagerness of this community to do something special for the kids in this community. And whether we have different approaches, whether we have a different, sort of how we take that on, we can debate that. And I think good debate is a good thing. But the notion that every student gets a fantastic education in this community, I think that group wants to see that happen based on what I've seen and what I've heard. And I think we have to honor that to some extent. Let me just walk through a few more things. Again, professional years, not gonna walk through all of those pieces there. Really excited about the work that we did, and again, really excited that it was very similar to what's going on in Rochester. I left the Cincinnati Public Schools about 7 years ago. Because of the work that we did in Cincinnati, I was actually recruited to the University of Virginia. My role at the University of Virginia was to lead the redesign on how that program supported schools and districts across the country. The University of Virginia's program is a partnership between the Curry School of Ed and the Darden Business School. And it actually sort of leans a little bit more on the Darden Business School side. My task was to redesign how we supported schools and districts across the country. I am exceptionally proud to tell you that in December of 2017, the RAND Corporation, which is one of the most highly respected organizations in the country that does evaluations, identified our work at the University of Virginia as the most successful school turnaround model in the country. There are examples throughout this country in which we spent time in those districts, very similar to Rochester's situation, and did some incredible work, and I'm really proud of that work. For the past 2 years, based on the work that I did at UVA, I went back home a little bit to Georgia. And the reason I went home is that we were actually working in Atlanta, UVA, and the list, kind of like your receivership list, came out. And the school that I attended when I lived in the house on the left, Hodge Elementary School, was on the list 40 years later. Having a few conversations, I ultimately decided that there were little Erics and little Ericas that I had an opportunity to have an impact on. It was one of the best decisions I ever made. We have laid, in actually a very short amount of time, a foundation that did not exist. We've laid a foundation in which schools and districts now have a strategic approach based on what the state wants to see happen to support those schools, to advance those schools, and early results have absolutely been phenomenal. I'm really excited about that work. We laid the foundation. I've got a number 2 person that's there, that's ready to take the mantle. She's really excited about the work. Rochester provides an opportunity. It's been my dream for the past 10 years to be a district superintendent. And it's an opportunity to take the work that I have led in supporting schools and districts across the country and ensure that the work gets done with fidelity, with a high level of execution, with a high level of accountability. It's the work that I know. It's the work that I've done. Here's the question, and I'll take just a couple more minutes. that I was asked to sort of address initially. What in my personal background, my professional background, allows me to say, you know what, you're ready to do this work? Context matters. Leading a district with 500 students looks different than leading a district with 400,000 students. Leading a district with tons of money looks different than leading a district that doesn't have lots of money. Leading a district that's growing enrollment looks different than leading a district that is losing enrollment. Context matters. In Ohio, a unionized state. New York, a unionized state. If there's any teachers in the building, you appreciate the concept of being a unionized state. In my work in Cincinnati, we actually got to the point, I was responsible for hiring assistant principals and principals. If we had external individuals apply, if they had not come from a state that had unions, we generally did not consider them. Because if you're familiar with K-12 education in a unionized state versus a non-unionized state, it's an entirely different conversation. Context matters. An engaged school board. We just had a couple community members who are engaged. I read the newspaper here. I've been reading it for the last 4 weeks. Your school board here is engaged. Context matters. How do you manage and work with and be partners with that school board? Context matters. We've talked about stakeholders wanting to be engaged. The idea of state intervention. Context matters. In my work now, I'm responsible for 8 school districts. In Ohio, I supported the Ohio Department of Ed as a consultant in working with low-performing districts who were that close to being taken over by the state. In my work at UVA, the examples are numerous. If we work with you, that's because you were on the verge of being either taken over by the state or that there was some intervention with the state. Context matters. This idea about focusing on academic and non-academic barriers, that's where Rochester is. And that transformation is needed. Context matters. As I close, and then I'll open up for questions, I'm going to emphasize the word ready. Ready. Not prepared, but ready. I'm ready to build on what Rochester already has in place. This isn't a matter of starting from scratch, because there are some incredible opportunities that stakeholders are already involved in. So to suggest that there are no assets in Rochester, that would be erroneous. How do we build on the fact that stakeholders want to be involved and build on some of the things that are already in place? I'm ready to work with the various unions. Ready to work with the various unions. And that's really critical. I'm ready to work with a very engaged school board. That's very important. And I've had that experience. Ready to work and focus on non-academic barriers just as well as academic barriers. I'm ready to do that work. I've done that work. I'm ready to do that work here in Rochester. We're not going to walk through this. There's a concept here in Rochester called Rock the Future. Let me tell you where Rock the Future started and how it evolved. There's an organization called the Strive Partnership that started in Cincinnati. And it's an organization that simply brings various entities together to try to have a common approach to address challenges in education. That started about 12 years ago in Cincinnati. That organization branched out and started something called the Strive Network. There are about 70 networks across the country. Rock the Future is one of those networks. So this idea of collective impact and pulling people together and working in unison to do the work, I was the superintendent's designee for Strive. I don't know how to work in any other fashion than to work together. That's just the way I think. So what you know as Rock the Future literally originated in Cincinnati under the Strive Partnership that I was directly a part of. Ready to work with unions. There's a body of research that talks about the impact of unions in each state, 50 states. New York is considered to have the 9th greatest level of influence in K-12 education. The unions in New York have the 9th greatest level of influence. Ohio's number 12. I spent 18 years in Ohio. When we talk with teachers and we talk with administrators and any of our union folks, that relationship is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. In Cincinnati, the labor management concept about collaboration, Cincinnati is actually a national model. You've got a handout and there's a website. I encourage you, if you get a chance, to actually take a look at the website. It'll give you the resource. It'll give you the documentation. That's the background. I'm ready to do that work. And the last one I'll identify here is this idea about teacher evaluation. If you talk to any teacher, here's what they want to know more than anything. How do I get evaluated? What does that look like? In Cincinnati, I led our work to redesign our teacher evaluation system. For any of you, if you remember Race to the Top, and as a part of the Race to the Top, you had to redesign your evaluation process to include certain things. Ohio was a Race to the Top state. I was charged with working with our teachers union for an entire year to redesign the evaluation process. That evaluation process, and if you notice how I emphasize it, it went away from simply evaluating, and it became a greater focus on coaching and developing. So it wasn't about whether you're good or bad. It was really how can you grow and how can we coach you and improve you. It became more of a developmental system. That system became the model for the entire state of Ohio. So when I talk about being ready to work with the unions, I've done that work. The last point I'll emphasize here, this idea of academic and non-academic support. It's hard to see, but in the left column, or in the sort of the left bottom quadrant, in our work now in Georgia, we created what we call as a health and wellness initiative. For all of the schools that we work with, we do health screens for those students. Because you and I both know there are some students who walk in every single morning who didn't have a good meal the night before. There are some students who walk in every single morning who have asthma, who have hearing, vision, oral health challenges, and then we wonder why they don't achieve academically. So our vision and what we've implemented, and again, that's why I say the foundation is there, and that's why I'm comfortable handing the work off in Georgia. We do health screens in 7 areas. We take the data from those 7 areas and then refer the students, if it's a vision issue, we refer them to someone, sort of in the vision field. Oral health, hearing, whatever the case may be, so that we can help the school and the parent address those non-academic barriers. We also have a huge focus on mental health. 90% of our schools identified mental health, student mental and behavior health, as their #1 sort of non-academic challenge. So that's a huge emphasis on us, for us. Student nutrition, another huge emphasis. And then that third piece down here is staff wellness. We do a lot of work, and it's what I've done for the past, really 15 years, around how do we ensure that our staff are taken care of. So not only are we focused on the health and wellness of students, but we're focusing on the health and wellness of our staff. Because if you want to talk about teacher retention, you want to start talking about teacher morale, you want to start talking about recruiting teachers to your school and to your community, you've got to take care of them. So we actually have a system in place where every school develops a health and wellness program for their staff. That's how we focus on those non-academic pieces. Not going to walk through these pieces here. The Community Learning Center concept, you've got a 1-page handout. I'd encourage you. Google Community Learning Centers, Cincinnati. There's conversation around community schools. Same concept, exact same concept. There's a body of research around community learning centers. I don't want to tout Cincinnati too much. However, there's sort of a national model for community learning centers that was established in Cincinnati. The MORE Initiative, here in Rochester, there's a concept called My Brother's Keeper, based on the Obama administration's support for minority males. That started in 2008, 2010. As a high school principal in 2004, we started a program called MORE, Men Organized, Respectful, and Educated. It's become a national model to support the My Brother's Keeper program. When I left Cincinnati, we had 10 programs, started with one, my high school, went to 10. The board asked me to replicate it for the district. In Cincinnati, 28 of the 56 schools now have a MORE program. It's gotten national recognition. We've had visitors, recently visitors from the Obama administration before he left office to come and sort of learn what was going on to replicate it throughout the country. As I take on questions now, the final piece that I would say before I address any of your questions, I'll go back to context matters. Rochester is in a very dynamic place, and pivotal place. And you have an opportunity, or the board has an opportunity, based on input from you guys. And I would encourage you to be very thoughtful about context. The fact that this is a unionized state, the size of the district, and the work that needs to be done in this district. Context matters. I'm not going to walk through the rest of these pieces here. Again, just some information as a high school principal, some of the work that we did. Again, I talked about the F to B in Cincinnati, the RAND Corporation's work at the University of Virginia, and this focus on innovation, which I think the district absolutely needs. So with that,
Okay.
I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Eric. So, my name is Shanique Bird. I will be the moderator for you today. So, let's just get started on how this will work. I will ask one question from our online platform, and it's been pre-selected. Our next question would come from the audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to fill out the forms. Now, each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer the question. Okay? All right, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Our first question. How do you plan to improve the graduation rate for African American males?
I think there's multiple opportunities. And let me preface any answer that I give. Eric Thomas is probably not going to do anything. We are going to do this work. So I think that's really important. If anyone thinks that there's some Superman that's going to fly into Rochester and he or she is going to somehow miraculously do some incredible work by him or herself, that's just not going to happen. And anyone who suggests that that's going to happen, I'd encourage you to sort of run the other direction. I think we can sit down. We can look at best practices throughout the country. We can get input from those African American males and other males and appreciate their voice. I think too many times as adults, we think we have the answers where, let's listen to the kids. The example that I would use is the MORE initiative. And again, it's My Brother's Keeper for Rochester. How do we enhance that? How do we monitor that? How do we identify kids as early as possible so that we can intervene? I think it always goes back to what happens in the classroom. So how can we make sure that the opportunities that students are receiving are engaging? They're rigorous. We're forcing kids to think at high levels. So I think there's a myriad of different things that we can do. Again, I think My Brother's Keeper, the MORE initiative, I would say maybe is a key example. I think we can also leverage, the fantastic, again, we talk about engaged stakeholders. How do we leverage engaged stakeholders in that manner? My experience simply is people want to be involved. Let's give them something to do and hold them accountable to them doing it. So I think those are just a couple of examples.
Okay, great. Next question. What is a good way to keep teachers and administrators accountable for good teaching?
From a teaching standpoint, and again, we talked about the teacher evaluation concept and really driving teacher evaluation to more teacher development. And again, I'll just use that example a little bit. One of the things that we did in that sort of process is, again, we co-designed it with teachers, and I think that's most important. We co-designed it with teachers. We work with teachers to identify 2 or 3 areas that they wanted to focus on. So, you know, in New York, there's academic or teacher standards. So what are the 2 or 3 things that we want or that they want to work on? And when we go and evaluate teachers, when we do classroom walkthroughs, when we do observation and feedback conversations, we're focused on those areas that they say that they want to focus on, because now we're working with this together. We're co-creating, we're in unison. My experience has been, you know, when the administrator simply is going in and seeing what he or she sees on their own, it becomes this adversarial relationship. The teachers think such things are going on, the administrator has a different point of view, whereas if we're working in unison and we're partners, all with the goal of helping, providing a great instructional opportunity for kids, I think we have a great opportunity to do really good work. Other pieces to that, there's a concept called instructional rounds. An instructional round simply is where you have potentially lead teachers, administrators. We go and spend 10 or 15 minutes in a classroom. We step outside, spend a 5 minutes kind of huddling, and then we identify what are 2 or 3 pieces of small bite-sized feedback to give to those teachers. So I think those are a couple of examples on how we can ensure that teachers are progressing, teachers are improving, and we're doing it together. We're not doing it to them, we're doing it together. And again, I think that's where that union piece is really important.
Great. Now, what are your thoughts on the school to prison pipeline?
I think it's probably been 15 years ago. There's a, I guess, author, a scholar by the name of Kunjufu. And if you're familiar with any of his literature, it was the first time, and again, it's about 15 years ago, where he talked about how prisons are identified and the number of seats you need in prisons based on 3rd grade reading scores. That there's this alignment and correlation between 3rd grade reading scores in prison. What does that mean? That means that we need to make sure kids are reading by 1st, 2nd grade. So we can talk about the pipeline, we can talk about the prison concept. Again, in my mind, when we have that conversation, we're sort of reacting. I think what we really have to do is sort of be very proactive. How do we ensure that in pre-K, in kindergarten, when we talk about parent engagement, when we talk about stakeholder engagement, Rock the Future has one of its tenets or one of its goals is around early literacy. So how do we ensure that all of our young men, and quite honestly, all of our students, that by 2nd grade, not by 3rd grade, by 2nd grade, that they've got strong vocabulary, they've got strong reading habits, so that we're not ever talking about this idea of this sort of prison pipeline. However, if we have students who at 3rd grade, 4th grade, not quite reading where we want them to read, what are those interventions? What are those practices that we're going to put in play? And again, how do we engage the community to do that? So that, you know, the conversation about the prison pipeline, we're not waiting until kids are in high school to start worrying about what they're doing or not doing, because by then, it's too late. We've got to address kids and their challenges and their deficiencies, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. How do we engage stakeholders? How do we engage parents in that work? It's got to be proactive. It's just got to be proactive.
Okay, that's great. Now, how would you work with the teachers union?
As I shared, and I think it's one of the most pivotal pieces. I really do. I think it's one of the most pivotal pieces. There has to be a partnership. And my experience has been that when you partner with teachers, quite honestly, you partner with any entity, they will be a part of the ownership of whatever work that takes place. If there's someone in the central office building, or if there's the principal and he or she's simply trying to create edicts and directives, everyone may not publicly admit to this, but we know how that works. You know, you tell us to do A, B, or C, and you know, if you come in my room, I'll fake it for you. But the moment that you leave my room, I'm going to go back and do whatever it is I choose to do. Whereas, if we co-create those expectations, we co-create those goals, we work as partners with a common goal, you have as much ownership for process of students or progress of students as I do. So again, I think it's this whole concept of how do we come together and do this work together. I think, again, I'll use Rock the Future as a great opportunity to do that. Some of the parent engagement work is a great opportunity to do that. And again, the experience working directly with teachers, unions, and associations, I think that's most pivotal, extremely pivotal, and that's my experience.
All right, thank you. So how would you deal with racism in schools?
You know, it's 2019, and unfortunately, if you look at the, 9 a.m. news or the 11 p.m. news, you see a lot of different things going on, and, we could have that conversation. And I think we have to have those conversations. Because I think racism is really about not being aware and not having the sort of openness that people see things a little bit differently, or that people have different backgrounds. So in my mind, if we're gonna ever talk about prejudice, racism, discrimination, all those things, we've gotta talk about it. I think what most times happen is that this group over here, they talk to themselves, and this group over here, they talk to themselves, and then we sort of volley back and forth, why they don't do this and why they don't do this. What we really need to do is bring both of those groups to the same table in some sort of facilitated forum, and let's really appreciate, what's your perspective here? What are you seeing that they don't see? What are you guys seeing that they don't see? And how can we come to some level of common ground? My experience has been when you pull people together, if we're all about kids, and I think you always have to anchor there. If we're all about kids, I think we can figure out there's some common ground on this side, there's some common ground on this side. Are we gonna 100% agree? Maybe we won't. But if we can get some common ground to come toward the middle, I think it gives us the best opportunity to do the right work for kids, and that's all kids. Kids don't, I always say this, kids don't know what their zip code is when they're born. Kids have no control how many parents are in their household. Kids have no control what they look like in the mirror. Kids have no control over how much income comes into their house. Kids have no control over that. Kids are just kids. It's we adults that have to take the ownership for ensuring that kids, not only progress, but they learn how to function within a society that is diverse and actually will probably be even more diverse.
Great. Okay, our next question. Please give an example of a difficult situation you had with a union and how you handled it and how it was resolved.
I'll struggle on that one because there weren't many. There were not many. I'll share this one, and it wasn't difficult. It really wasn't difficult. As a high school principal, we were trying to turn our school around, and the phrase turnaround didn't exist, quite honestly. You're just trying to do the right work. And one of the things that we had a conversation about is we really need some of our strongest teachers at the 9th grade. That's where we really, again, proactive versus reactive. So we need some of our strongest teachers at 9th grade. The contract did not specifically speak about how teachers are assigned. There was a culture that said, as you get up in years, you kind of become junior teachers, senior teachers, that sort of thing. But there was no contract language that required that. In Cincinnati, we had something at the school level called the ILT, the Instructional Leadership Team. Any of those sort of decisions had to go through the ILT. If you wanted to change the bell schedule, you wanted a different sort of curriculum, materials, teacher assignments, all of that had to be approved by the ILT. The ILT was made up of 60% teachers by contract. That was contract language. Collective bargaining agreement said that the ILT had to have 60% representation by teachers. So as the administration, I just couldn't decide A, B, and C. So I went to some of our stronger teachers in the building, and basically, how can we improve our school? And we started talking about different, possibilities. And I put, kind of put a log on the fire. What if we could figure out a team of really good upper class teachers to start over with our ninth graders and then follow them, we call that looping, and then follow them year by year. So that for a couple of years, you may give up your junior, senior courses, but you'd get them back. Talked about it. There was one teacher who was concerned about that. Just one teacher who was concerned about that. And again, that's why I said I'm not sure if this was a challenge. I simply gave it to the other teachers. You guys go and make that work. You guys go and talk to that one teacher, because we seem to be in agreement, and I allowed her colleagues to basically encourage her, to support her in making that decision. Ultimately, she did not make that decision, and she transferred. I was comfortable with that. She was a really good teacher. I was comfortable with that because the ILT, literally, and she was on the ILT, in a 13-1 vote, we passed it in a 13-1 vote. And again, 8 of the 14 members were teachers. So there was one teacher, that particular teacher, who chose not to sort of go in that direction. It was the right thing to do. It was the right thing for kids. That group of teachers, when they went down to ninth grade, you want to talk about turning our school around. That was one of the most pivotal decisions that school ever made. And again, it wasn't Eric's decision. It was the ILT's decision.
Okay. All right, so how do you see yourself interacting with the students?
Here is, I think, one of the greatest things, and it's one of the things I like about Rochester. First of all, it's relatively close. It's not overly spread out. So the idea of being able to get to various schools and interact with students is really powerful. Here's what I miss more than anything. It's Friday night football. You get the band going a little bit. You get a little rallying, pep rallies and all of those sort of things. Friday night basketball the same way. You got the cheerleaders going. What an incredible opportunity. So I envision myself being a part of that. Not sure what that looks like every night, what that would look like every night. I think my wife would get into that. But I think there's such a pivotal piece for the students in this community to see, and I just want to make sure I say this right, to see that everyone is rallying around them, that we're all in this together. I don't just see Eric being a part of supporting kids. I envision seeing our community stakeholders supporting our kids. I envision seeing our parents supporting our kids. So again, this is never going to be about Eric. It's going to be about all of us doing this work together. With the My Brother's Keeper program or more, one of the things that we did is we had a representative, a young man from each school, represent their school, and we met monthly. And it was an opportunity for me to sort of keep my pulse on the school. So that was an example that we did. Kids give you energy.
Right.
Kids give you energy. So yeah, I definitely see myself being directly engaged. I'll give another example. My wife is not in the room. She's here in town, but she's not in the room at the moment. As a high school principal, my wife has an English background. So we wanted to start an AP class. When I went to the school, we had no dual enrollment classes, no AP classes, any of those sort of things. So my wife actually volunteered to co-teach 11th and 12th grade English, 12th grade AP English for the school. So once a week, she was directly engaged with students, one of the greatest opportunities that she had. So again, we're gonna do this together. We're gonna do this together.
Oh, that sounds great. Okay, so what are you prepared to do to replicate programs that are going well, to create variables for students?
Here is, and that's such a great question. If you see the screen, and again, I didn't walk through everything on that presentation, but the quote at the bottom is one of my favorite quotes. And it's from Edward Demings. And the quote simply states, that organizations are uniquely, incredibly, and excellently designed to get the results that it gets. Now, if you're happy with those results, you keep doing what you're doing. If you're not happy with those results, then you have to do something different. I became the Chief Innovation Officer for Cincinnati Public Schools because, that's just the way I think. I'm always looking at, we're not happy with these results, so let's do something different. We have to do something different. As a part of that doing something different, there's a concept called design thinking, and it really comes a little bit more from the business sector. And what design thinking basically entails is that, and we do this poorly in K-12 education. In K-12 education, we come up with an idea, and we roll it out at scale. We roll it out at every school, every grade level, whether teachers are ready, whether administrators have been trained or not, we just roll it out because we read it in some literature that it's a good idea. What design thinking does is it pulls people together and you basically create a little bit of a pilot. And you execute the pilot for a short amount of time, you learn from that pilot, you redesign it, you enhance it, and then you begin to scale it. Design thinking. That's sort of my mindset. In the work that I do now, there are very few things that we work with at scale. We started at a small level, build on it, and build on it some more. Here's what happens every day when you go shopping. If there's a product that you see, do understand that that product did not just show up. There was a process to get to that product. It was marketed in a particular venue first. If the results say that maybe it's something that we can do, it may be given to another venue, another market area. By the time it gets to the supermarket or to the car lot or whatever it is, it's went through this design thinking process so that now you're replicating something that works, something that people that people are satisfied with. And so again, that's just the way that I think. And again, my work as the Chief Innovation Officer, I think here, how do we learn from what's taking place at East High School? And my understanding about East is, you've got a partnership with the university, you've got a lot of focus on non-academic support, call it wraparound support, the whole child, whatever terminology you choose to use. How do we learn from what's happening in that partnership and attempt to replicate it? But don't take this East High School model and tomorrow decide that that's going to work throughout the district. Context matters. So there may be elements of what's taking place at East or at School 17, or whatever the data tells us. If there are some good practices, whatever the data tells us, let's take it and let's try it in a few schools, maybe at just a few grade levels. Tweak it a little bit, learn from it a little bit, improve it, and then let's talk about scaling it up from there.
Okay. So how do you plan on supporting students and families who are not from this country and struggle with English?
I think one of the most powerful pieces, and that's something that got fantastic experience around. In most settings, I think there's a great opportunity to do some sort of newcomer program, and I think we have that here in Rochester. How do we enhance that? As students and families come to the community, and this is not their native language, this is not their native community, how do we provide them the resources, the knowledge, the opportunities that will help them from an academic standpoint? And again, we would all come together to make these sort of decisions. But I think there is an opportunity as kids come in and they're not where we want them to be from a language standpoint. Do we provide them a 3-month, a 6-month, a 9-month, maybe even a year opportunity where there's deep immersion into not only English, but how do we ensure vocabulary? Because my experience has been when you start talking about language deficiencies, it's about vocabulary. So, can we look at sort of a transition program that for 3 months or 6 months, they're really sort of just learning some vocabulary and some basic skills, and their families are learning what are the opportunities they have before we transition them either the second half of that year or next year into a little bit more of the general population. Again, there's some really strong practices. In my work, we did a lot of work in San Antonio. We did a lot of work in New Mexico. where, English language learners is quite honestly the strongest population, the highest population. So I think there's some best practices that we can learn, and I've got a network to leverage. So I think there are lots of opportunities there.
Okay. Now, will there be a hand-picked team to support you if selected? Now, how would you usher in the new culture change for Rochester City School District?
Here is my experience. I think it would be a mistake to suggest that there's nothing positive going on in Rochester City Schools. I know there's some people that may say that. That's not what the data says. That's not what the culture says. Again, I've spent 3 days in Rochester, and yes, are there challenges? Yes, there are challenges, you know that. But there are also some really good things going on. So from a staffing or personnel standpoint, from a team standpoint, I think my number one task would be to have some really good conversations with the senior team here in the district, some really good conversations with our board, some really good conversations with some of our school leaders to really just understand, what, should a cabinet team look like? Are there individuals that, we absolutely need to ensure that this person is valued and this person is a part of the team? If there needs to be some conversations at some point about, individuals being in different seats. Because again, it's always about a fit. So I think we've got to be open to that conversation. But I would say the most important piece, in my mind, do we have people that cares about kids, committed to kids, number one. I'm a firm believer you can teach anybody just about anything, but you've got to really love kids and really value kids. So I think that's number one. And are we willing to work cohesively? Are you a team player? Because if we've got those two things, we can figure out the right seat that people should be in, and if there's some technical gaps or knowledge gaps, capacity gaps, we can fine tune those. But you've got to love kids, and you've got to be able to be willing to work as a team.
Okay, what changes, if any, would you bring to Rochester City School District?
Changes. I think Rochester is in a very unique situation because, there's this Distinguished Educators Report that at this point is really a little bit of the roadmap. And when I met with the board, I guess a month ago, we sort of walked through how do we align those recommendations with national best practices. And without getting too technical here, in my work, we focus on 4 major levers. We do an incredible amount of focus on leadership, an incredible amount of focus on what we call the instructional infrastructure, that's the teaching and learning components, an incredible amount of work on talent management, that's the retention, recruitment, development of teachers and leaders, and then we do a lot of work around what we call a support and accountability. And what that means is the relationship between schools and the district. In my experience, when you walk into a district that has not been very successful, those are the 4 areas that you have to address. Again, when we talk about the RAND Corporation and a national evaluation that says the work that we supported schools and districts on across the country, that this approach is the most successful approach literally in the country, I think we have to at least honor what that research says. So what I did was a little bit of a crosswalk. And again, if there are any board members, you probably recall this conversation. I did a little bit of a crosswalk of the 80 whatever number of recommendations, and I tried to, where does this recommendation fit into these levers, into those 4 levers? And I think, I'd have to go back and look, I think if not everything, just about fit it under one of those levers. So when we talk about changes, I think in my mind, we would utilize the Distinguished Educators Report as a little bit of a roadmap. From a vocabulary, from a language standpoint, I would probably want us to start thinking about, okay, here's the national best practice around turnaround and utilize that language. But as far as the practices themselves, the Distinguished Educators Report actually does a really good job, and I know people have different opinions about it, but it actually does a really good job of laying out what are some of those things that need to happen to significantly improve the school. And I'm very comfortable and very supportive of what the report says.
Okay. Now, can you describe the moment you realized that you were a change agent for student success? in education?
The moment? Oh, God. The moment.
That moment.
I'm not sure if this is the moment. I'll share this example, though. And I think I was a high school principal. We had a young man, Shaman, and he worked with in the summer, he worked with his brother doing construction. Great job, great job. And he was doing summer school, I guess from like 8 to 12, and then go to the construction site, I guess from 12 to 5 or whatever. And he would come in late every day to summer school. And I sort of figured out what was going on with him. It's like, Mr. Thomas, God, I just, I don't get enough sleep. I have to go and do all of this work. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And what I pulled him aside and I said, Shaman, do appreciate, first of all, it's honest work. And I respect anybody who goes and does honest work and make an honest living. But what I tried to help him appreciate that if you decide to do school the right way, that's the door opener. That's the mechanism so that maybe you don't have to do, sort of really hard labor every day. Again, I don't know that was a change agent per se, but it really helped me appreciate sort of the voice that I had in dealing with students. And then I would share that story oftentimes with staff, that we have an opportunity, and it's really education is the driver, we have an opportunity to influence, to impact not just this kid, but when we impact Shaman and Eric, we're impacting their children. We're now impacting the entire community. And if you ever want a great United States, oh my God, if you ever want a great country, what would happen if most all of our students got a rich educational experience? You want to talk about eliminating racism? You want to talk about eliminating prejudice and all of those sort of ills? If we can educate all of our kids, I truly think that's the change. So I don't know if that's the best example, but I have to go and really dive into that example, but helping kids appreciate that education really is the driver. I've got to give this example.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I've got to give this example. It just came to me. It was Joe. I was a high school principal on this one. 11th grader, Aiken High School, struggling. Teacher brings him to me. Strong kid, good kid, solid academics, day by day going backwards. I grab Joe, we walk to the front of the building, we get in my car. We go up Belmont Avenue, get on I-75 South, get off on the Ezra Charles Drive exit, we turn left, and we pull up in front of that building on the right. 879 Ezra Charles Drive. We get out of the car, we go up to the second floor, apartment G. And I'm sure by now Joe's looking at me like, what the hell are you doing? And I simply pointed at the apartment. I had a shirt and tie on. We just got out of a really nice car. I kind of know how to speak the King's English when I want to speak the King's English. And I pointed at that apartment. And I said, Joe, that's where I grew up at. And he looked at me. I didn't say a word. We got back in the car, jumped on I-75 going north, Springdale exit, took a left, a right, Winford Court, 1534 Winford Court. I hit the garage button, the garage door comes up, and I think he starts to figure out that I live there now. And I simply told Joe, Joe, please don't ever because he was talking, you know, the man this and people are holding me back and, you know, all of that stuff. And I was like, Joe, please don't ever talk to me about what you can't do. Because you know my history, you know where I started, and you know where I'm at today. So please don't tell me about being a poor black kid. Please don't tell me about growing up in the projects. Please don't tell me any of that stuff. I share that with Joe, and I shared it with many, you know, students and staff after that, to help them appreciate that our kids can do anything that we give them the tools and the structures to achieve. And we have to own that. So I apologize, but that one, sorry.
Okay. So what is your experience with poverty, high crime rates, and low graduation rates? And what will you implement to address those three dynamics for students to succeed in the Rochester City School District?
Poverty, low graduation rate. Been there, done that. Again, I'll simply say, and I'll try to keep this one very concise. As a high school principal, that's the situation we were in, very much in. In fact, when I went to as a high school principal, I went to a school that was the worst academically school in the district. We had 60 schools. Aiken High School was number 60. The community was actively trying to close the campus down. We, in a very short order, did some really unique work with the community to really, obviously, become a B school and one of the better schools in the state. As a district, again, Cincinnati Public Schools, very similar to Rochester. Demographics, socioeconomic status, very similar to Rochester. You know, racial demographics, very similar to Rochester. Again, went from, you know, an F district to a B district. You know, so all of those ills, crime rate, graduation rate, all of those sort of things. So that is my experience. You know, if you go back to my professional career, I'll say this. I'm not sure I would know what to do in a affluent suburban school district, to be quite honest. That's just not my background, that's not my experience. My background, my experience is supporting schools, districts, students, communities, and families that at a point in time, they are not performing where they want to perform. And collectively, we design strategic plans and action plans to move our school. And again, I wish I could say this was about Eric, that Eric has the secret sauce. It's about us working together.
Okay. Now, what steps would you take to be a better facilitator in the leadership of the elected board?
I don't know if we've got any board members in the room, but when I met with the board, and hopefully they're okay with me saying this, when I met with the board a month ago, we had a little conversation, and I can't remember my exact words, but what I said to the board was, this is never going to work unless we work together. Period. Again, I've you know, every other day I find out what's going on in Rochester. And, you know, without going into all of the details, I will simply say this is never going to work unless the superintendent, the school board, unions, and the community work with a high level of coherence. It just will not work. With that being said, you know, I presently report to a 14-member board. So if you start thinking about 7 members here in Rochester, I report to 14, and we're a team. So it's a 15-person team, but technically I report to the board. It's a very diverse board. It's a board that represents the entire state of Georgia. So if you start thinking about what that looks like, you know, you've got some board members who are from Atlanta, and you've got some board members who are not from Atlanta. I'll just leave it there. That in itself is a dynamic that we have spent a lot of time working to identify what are we trying to accomplish, and we hold ourselves accountable to what we agreed on. so that we're not having one-offs. We're always trying to build consensus. We're always trying to come together. And again, I'm a former social studies teacher, so I always talk about democracy. In a democracy, you're not going to get everything that you want. It's about how do we build common ground and agree to common ground. But I think my experience, and that's why I use the word ready, with my 14-member board, we haven't had disagreements. When we don't see eye to eye, we always go back to what did we agree on? That's where we always anchor back to. Call it a strategic plan, call it protocols, call it norms, whatever you want to call it. Here's how we agreed that we were going to function as a team. Here are the deliverables that we said that we were going to monitor and support. You have a great idea. It's just not aligned to what we said we were going to do for the next 6 months. That's a great idea that you want to consider. It's just not one of our norms at the moment. And we're not willing to simply change everything that we agreed we're going to do because one person has maybe a slightly different idea. So ultimately, in working with the board, it has to be a team. In my present work, again, working with 14-member board, we've done board training with 8 school districts. So there's 8 school districts that have schools that I'm responsible for. So a part of our work is working directly with school boards and helping them appreciate what their role is in this turnaround process. My experience has been more times than not, the school board doesn't necessarily realize that they have a role, so we have to help them appreciate what that role is. So I've actually led training with school boards to facilitate this conversation about what their role is. And then the last example I will give in Cincinnati, I won't say 100% of the time, but more times than not, I was the designee for the superintendent in engaging with the school board. So most school board conversations actually went through me. And I simply share that because we've got to be a team. It's got to be a team effort. So I think that's most important.
Okay, so this is a 2-part question, and this is the last question.
Okay.
Do you speak Spanish? And what are your intentions towards the Spanish-speaking community of Rochester?
The first part of that answer, I do not speak Spanish. My wonderful wife does, but I do not speak Spanish. I wish I could say that I did. I took French in high school, and 30 years later, it's like, God, why did you do that? It is. In regards to how are we going to support, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to rephrase that question, or I'm going to phrase my answer, and I'm going to emphasize all kids. Because yes, do we have to honor students from different communities and different backgrounds, but we've got to honor all kids. And I think that's where we sometimes get in trouble and we start having divisions because it looks as if we're providing preferential treatment to this group and then this group gets upset. How about we just anchor on all kids? Then we take a really hard look at what the data tells us. And if this group of kids, based on the data, says that they need additional support, then we give them additional support. We're not giving them additional support because they are native to the United States or not, or their race. That's not why we're giving them additional support. We're giving them additional support because the data says that they need it. It's all about what the data says so that we're supporting all kids. And I think that's really, really important. Specific examples, just to honor the question, I think we really could provide, and it's one of the things that we've suggested in, I guess, 4 of the 8 districts we work at, that I'm working with now, because they have a pretty strong ELL population, is that we actually have created, I don't know if it's called a Hispanic advisory board, but it's a native language advisory board. And the districts work with those parents and community members on a monthly basis to identify what challenges and what gaps that they may have, and they align them with resources to attempt to address that. So those resources may be internal to the district, they may be external to the district. So if families cannot access certain things from a voting standpoint, or here's how we're going to help you. They can't access certain things from a medical and resources standpoint, or here's how we're going to connect you with those resources. What we have found is that until we support the parents and the families, it's hard to really address the student, that we really have to support the family and the parents first.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for doing this interview. And we're going to do a quick recess.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys. Really appreciate it.
Folks, we'll take about a 15-minute break, following which we're going to be joined by Dr. Sito Narcisse, the second candidate.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, God, when you first said I was messed up on your name. I was
Ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carl Christoph, the district's general counsel, and I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Board of Education to welcome you to this forum concerning the selection of our next superintendent of schools in Rochester. I have a few housekeeping announcements before I introduce our next candidate, so I'll do those first. First, restrooms, an important thing this time of the day, are outside in the hall. If you walk out the doors, turn left, and then at the first small corridor on the left, turn left again, and you will find the restrooms. In the unlikely event of an emergency, there are exits that we would certainly encourage you to use. There's the one, of course, the main door. There's one over here to my right, your left. And there's one also out in the very back of the auditorium if necessary. In terms of our format, each candidate is being given the opportunity to introduce himself, take about 10 minutes or so to make some introductory remarks, following which our moderator, Shanique Bird, is going to be asking them some questions. Some of the questions were, of course, pre-submitted, but you will also have an opportunity as the audience to ask questions. I hope that you had the opportunity to pick up some comment cards as you came in. If not, anyone raise their hands that don't have any, we'll certainly get them to you. And if you write a question on a card and hand it either to my friend Dr. Gianmartino or myself, we'll make sure that they get to the moderator, and hopefully in the round of questions, your questions will be asked. Also, there's another use for those cards, though, in the event that you don't want to ask a question. Please, if you just have a comment that you would like the board to consider, please write your comment on the card. And there's a box right on the registration table outside the door here, and you could drop those comments off, and they will certainly be considered. So with that said, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Sito Narcisse, and of course our moderator, Shanique Bird. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Narcisse.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to, So my name is Sito Narcisse. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to interview for the Superintendency of Rochester City School Districts. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am an English language learner. I was born in New York. My parents are from the island of Haiti. I grew up speaking French and Creole at home and learned English in school. My father, like many immigrants who came from another country, was a taxi driver. My mother, she worked various jobs until they got technical educations that changed their lives. And so I come to this job with that perspective. I started off my career. I am a middle child. I have an older brother and a younger brother that has taught me how to listen and negotiate, being a middle child in that view of the world. I have a daughter with special needs that I love dearly, who keeps me busy. I had her in a previous marriage, and I have also my wife, who's a very supporting person who also has a background in education. I got into education by tutoring kids while I was in college, and through community partnership work. And while I was tutoring the kids, they were from the urban city in Atlanta, and they could not read and write very well. And they were middle school, and so that really impacted how I looked at the world. And they also talked about how sometimes the school didn't connect with them in various pieces. And so that really struck a chord with me and had me go into education. I received a minority scholarship going into education where I became a French high school teacher. So I taught French for a few years, and then from there, I went on to the University of Pittsburgh to receive my doctorate in school and community partnership, and then from there, I became an assistant principal, and then a principal that opened a school, a 612 school in a challenging neighborhood in Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh Public Schools. I also was a principal in the Boston Public Schools of a turnaround school where I've learned, where we did some good work, but we also learned a lot of challenging things in that space. From there, I went on to become a director of school performance, which is a fancy name for principal supervisor in a district outside of Washington, D.C. for 38 schools, pre-K to 12. I then went on to a district called Prince George's County, Maryland, where I became an associate superintendent over 78 schools. Same thing from pre-K to high school. And then now I am currently the chief of schools in Metro Nashville Public Schools, where we have 167 schools, 86,000 students. I am the number 2 in charge, and I work on the day-to-day operations of the schools. In Nashville, in the state of Tennessee, titles are a little bit different. We don't have a deputy superintendent or superintendent. We call the chief of schools, what you call a deputy superintendent here in Rochester is what a chief of school is called in Nashville. And they call the superintendent a director of schools. So I just wanted to make sure you're kind of aware of that context. I come from a district that's very similar in terms of urban. Has a population of 43% black students, just over 23% Latino. We have large undocumented and over 70% poverty. And we go through the same sets of issues and challenges like every urban district in the United States. And I'm glad to be here.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're going to get started. Again, my name is Shanique Bird, and we are going to rotate questions between our online platform that was pre-selected and the questions that everyone in the audience has selected. Okay? So I'm going to get started. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. So my first question is, how do you plan to improve the graduation rate of African American males?
Yes, so currently in our current school system, our strategy is twofold. One is we've done strategies where we have learned how to try to give our African American boys specifically voice, because it's important to be able to engage them and let them have a conversation with you about the types of experiences that they go through. As you can imagine, growing up as a young black male, especially in today's times, is very challenging, especially if you're coming from poverty and other elements that work against you at times for success. The second piece that we work on is trying to make sure that we can kind of monitor their progress, not from the time they get to high school, but how do you do that starting at elementary school, creating a lot of space, and also providing a smaller counselor ratio. We've had some challenges around that in the district I'm coming from, because you have to put a certain amount of money to make sure that you have that in every single school. But that's been a strategy that we've looked at. And then we've put some interventions in place to make sure that we've kept them up with keeping up with their credits, and how do we are pushing to try to make sure that they are able to get credits before they get to the high school level, so we can make sure that they're staying on track for graduation. those have been some of the strategies. As you may learn, if you don't get the work done well with your African American males early, you then begin to create what we call the cradle to prison pipeline, which is where, if you haven't heard that, is where they're building jails for students at the 3rd grade level. So we have been really trying to make sure we're very aggressive in that space. We actually have a data marker that says that we are going to decrease the amount of African American students suspended in our school system.
Okay, that's great. So I do have to have a reminder that you have 90 seconds to answer each question, okay? All right. So the next question is from an audience member. It is, Rochester has an extreme and profound dropout rate, low graduation, and because of that, there is a lot of teenage pregnancy, poverty in Rochester. So how are you going to address and solve each of these issues?
So as I stated before, I wrote my dissertation on school community partnerships. So I'm a big believer that you cannot move the needle without the community. And when I talk about communities, not only the people that live there, but also the nonprofit organization and various other community partners that impact particular areas. One strategy that we use is a model that we use called Community Achieves in our current school district, where we have a facilitator that's in the schools that help to manage partnerships once children are identified with the challenges that they have, to be able to help galvanize support and resources around that. A component that's within that, we have a health and wellness piece. We have where we also deal with poverty and all these other components. And so we partner with those external agencies to be able to solve particular challenges in schools. Now, we say that schools, it's not that schools are part of, it's not that communities are part of schools, it's that schools are part of communities. So specific communities have specific challenges that have been plaguing them over time. And so you have to be really strategic and targeted on the type of wraparound services that you put around them so you can be able to combat those issues. Because that becomes kind of like that's kind of like the pattern. I tell folks, when you think about families who've had poor experience with schools, they've had poor experience with schools because that's usually generational. And so they stop believing in the schools, they stop believing people are gonna help support them. And so we have to put those those gaps in there to help build around those to change the trajectory.
Okay, now you kind of touched on this question. This is from a student. What are your thoughts on the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah, so the school to prison pipeline is something that has plagued many administrators over time, even myself, from watching it from being a principal in 2 urban cities to even being in the central office level. There are a lot of systematic pieces that hurt the cradle to prison pipeline. I even went to, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Children Defense Fund, where Marion Edelman Wright, who coined kind of that phrase around that work, had been pushing to change those strategies. Currently in Nashville, I'm on a group called Passages, and I represent the school district. Passages is a group where it's many different sets of agencies and partners with faith-based social services, the mayor's office, where we work to specifically try to push on 3 levers. 1, changing policies that contribute to the cradle to prison pipeline, which are usually around suspensions or keeping kids out of school. 2 is wraparound services in communities on making sure that we can put targeted pieces in place for there to engage kids. And the 3rd is student voice. How do we advocate to make sure kids' trajectories are different by the type of voices that they hear? We tell people all the time, if you want to know what the problem is with a child, all you got to do is ask them. If you want to know the type of experiences that they go through, all you got to do is tell them, connect with them, and they'll be able to clearly articulate all these components. But you have to be able to do a wraparound approach to change that pipeline, and that's the work that I've been in. So if I came to Rochester City School District as a superintendent, that would be the strategy I would be bringing to Rochester, because I've seen that be successful at a very high level, especially when everyone is coordinated around how to make that change.
Okay. So So this question is from the audience. It says, accountability has been an issue here. What types of structural changes do you propose to promote accountability at all levels and shifts the culture of, pointing fingers and blaming others?
So as I presented to as I was sharing about part of my 100-day plan is 5 areas. One is governance, organizational structure, looking at student achievement. The 4th is around how we work around family support with community engagement. And the 5th is operation and finances. In that area around organizational structure, we have to be organized in a way for efficiency to happen, so accountability is a part of that structure. And those accountability pieces have to be around how do you make sure that you provide the right structures and systems to make sure that you're supporting principals, to support for the central office to support principals, principals supporting teachers, and teachers supporting students. And that, to me, is kind of the structure that you have to put in place to kind of work through those wraparound services. A system gets better about worrying about accountability and pointing on those pieces when they know what they stand for and what their value is. And a part of the work that we have done in Nashville was create a strategic plan, which is kind of a roadmap around how we function around our people, our organization, our family support, and our communities. And those models help us to be able to articulate down what that work looks like, and also makes us to be clear about when we work on systems and structures, we put some accountabilities in places to make sure that we're following things. So currently right now in Nashville, in our 167 schools, we have principal supervisors that work closely with principals to be able to provide specific support to teachers. And we've done what they call a coaching model, is what we call it. And that coaching model helps to get them to work to plan through that. We also have created structures where we have teachers have voice to be a part of that process in that structure, so they can be able to see how they can help move and collaborate in the school. And so that's been kind of our approach and strategy. If I came to Rochester, I'd be looking at the same context in terms of building that accountability. And over time, as people feel that there's high accountability but also high support, they'd be able, that will eventually go away around those issues.
Okay. So what would you do to deal with racism in the schools? This question is from a student.
So racism is a real factor of America right now. It's the part of its fabric. But the reality, though, is that we have to be able to put structures and systems in place where we're building bridges amongst folks. And a lot of the times, those challenges become with biases or communities not integrating or learning from each other. Currently, right now, I'll give you a specific example in schools. Most of America has white teachers that teach students. Doesn't matter whether you're urban, suburban, whatever your context. In urban districts, just like ours, we have a majority of white female teachers who teach kids of color, who come from different socioeconomics, different areas. And our job is to figure out how do we build bridges with them to give them the tools that they need to not walk into that classroom to have a bias towards a child so they can't even begin to do the work. And that's a two-way piece, not just only on the teacher side, but it's also building with students on how to work with teachers around that. So components that we have done to address a lot of those racial issues has been to do things such as, for teachers would be around poverty simulations, implicit biases, building opportunities for student voice to happen. On the student side, building them around, getting them to figure out how to navigate and connect with their teachers and engagement. But the reality is it takes an entire village for us to work together to figure out here's what we stand for here in Rochester, and here's how we value those pieces. And how do we do that in all spaces, whether it's when we go to church or whether we go through working with partners or those pieces. And that's the reality on how we have to deal with some of those issues. I mean, even in our city, in the city I'm currently in right now, we deal with racism. I mean, we are in the South. And I tell folks there is a history of civil rights that we deal with some of these issues. But the reality is you have to build bridges and also help communities to integrate. And so some strategies that we have done is how do we do community events in different specific areas where we're making sure we're intentional inviting different sets of communities at the table, not only by race, but also by like ethnicity, right? Because you have people who speak different colors. I tell folks in my work that I work in urban spaces, cultures, just because people are Latinos, I'll use that as an example. Puerto Rican Dominicans have a different view of the world sometimes, and so you have to integrate that, or an African American and a Haitian, so there's all these different dynamics. That's what makes our country fragile, but it's also what makes our country strong.
Thank you. So this question is from an audience member. It says, what are your experiences with implementing strategies to keep schools safe?
So that's probably the thing that keeps me up at night, what keeps me up at night is anything happening to students and teachers in a school. As you know, the current climate we're in with shooters that come into school and those pieces. So the number one thing we do currently in the district I'm in is around providing training for like active shooters and doing various components of that on how a school can manage that in the particular community, or how they lock down a school. And so that has helped to kind of address some of those issues. I will tell you something that's very controversial that I'm not in favor for. I do not believe teachers should have guns. So I tell folks, teachers should teach, and then we should be able to work with our federal agencies on trying to provide safety and security and all that. I think they have a hard time already trying to make sure they connect with our young people, so adding a gun in that space would be a very different element, and so that's not something I'd be an advocate for.
Okay. So how do you feel or see yourself interacting with the students? This is a question from one of the students.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I'll say the same thing I said in the last room. I give Rochester City, a school board, and the community extraordinary credit, because you had kids in the process. There are a lot of times that districts go through this, and you're talking to adults all the time, but there's no children who are actually going through these experiences or ask any questions. And so I think that is a huge thing. One of the things, I'll give you an example of what we've done in the district I came from, and then what I would do if I became the superintendent here. So one thing we've done is we've created groups where, like social emotional learning teams, where we provided kids with student voice. One of the things that we've done recently, which was very powerful, was that we had a group of students from various high schools come and talk to principals at a principal meeting about their school and culture climate. And so, as you can imagine, not every data point was great, but the reason that we ended up doing that was because kids were able to tell them, this is what I'm experiencing. And we're not talking about kids who were performing top, a wide range of kids. And so principals began to listen to that and begin to say, oh, something, okay, I didn't think about it from that perspective. I could change that. Some principals are like, well, give me an example. And the kids would give them concrete examples. And so I'm a big believer in trying to engage students in that way. Another thing we've done also is create town halls for kids. So one of the things I would be doing, one I will tell you is everybody will know I'm the superintendent because I'm in schools all the time. We have 167 schools, and I go visit that in a year, so we have less schools here in Rochester. Going to visit schools. I would also create, if I became your superintendent, an advisory committee for students to meet with the superintendent monthly, and maybe create that within schools. And so I'd have to work that through my schedule. But I think that's important because that's another way to get what voices to kids. And so I believe that to solve an issue, you have to work with people closer to the problem, and children are closer to that issue.
Great. So this question is from someone in the audience. It says, do you have thoughts on how to educate staff on the reality of white privilege?
Yeah, so again, in all of my experiences, I've dealt with this. I've dealt with this as a principal. I've dealt with this in all of the districts. The reality is, I have not done the trainings personally. We've brought different people to the table to do that. And I would probably recommend always that you work with external groups to help do that, because it's highly tense when you do that type of work. So when you work around those specific areas, you can do that within the trainings around implicit biases and those components. But one of the things I will tell you is that we've learned a lot is a lot of the work not only has to be something, a training that you get, but it has to be job embedded. So teachers and different groups of folk can have examples on how they can work through those various issues around white privilege. It is something that does exist. But the reality is, how do we kind of figure out ways to give strategies? What's really important to me is that we're always focusing on getting higher quality in our classrooms for students to do higher performance so kids can actually graduate and be college and career ready.
Okay. So this question is from a student. How do you plan on supporting students and families who are not from this country and struggle with English?
So as a child who lived through that, there's a couple of things that we've done in our district which has been really good. One is we've partnered with our Chamber of Commerce, where we've done things like created a family night for some of our families that do not speak English, whether it's Latino families or various group of families. So we can help them not only learn how to engage with the school district, but also how to navigate. When I went through that experience, my parents, who came from the island of Haiti, would just send me to school and just say, do well. They trust that the school was going to do the best that it was going to do. And when I didn't do well, they came back and said, well, you didn't do well. Now, my parents didn't get caught up into the, what are all these factors that could have impacted me not doing well, but they trust the system. And so teaching parents how to navigate and go through those processes would have helped a lot in those pieces. What ended up happening for my parents was, as they got older and as they've been here longer in the country and learned how to navigate, they were able to figure out how to go through those processes. So one of the things I've learned is that in a lot of my experiences have been, we create opportunities for those families in a lot of different ways in different parts of the community on how to navigate and connect with schools. And you can do that through Parent University, and there's a lot of different sets of strategies. We've done that in our district in that way, but the big piece, as I tell folks, is not every community connects with schools in the same way, and so we have to figure out what's that component in that community, working with the different partners in that group, whether it's church groups or nonprofit groups, to help us galvanize around supports for those families.
Okay. So this question is from one of the audience members. It says, in Rochester, a kid is bused all over the city because the state only reimburses for 1.5 miles or longer rides. Parents must bus for safety and pick a kid up for 1.5 miles or anything more than that. This destroys the neighborhood schools. Only about 17% of students attend from the neighborhood. How might you fix that?
Yeah, so I believe in neighborhood and community schools, I tell folks, and that strategy has, many people have used that strategy. I mean, in Nashville, we ended up using the strategy of busing because we were trying to desegregate, right? There's a lot of reasons why people have done that, but it has impacted communities. We have a current community that suffers right now because of that. Transportation is the largest budget, usually in a budget. That cost is always the highest. And so the question, I think, that I would tell folks is that we have to figure out as a community and a district, as we work through, what are the things that we value the most, and then we can now organize to make that change. At that time, in the district I currently work in, their biggest focus was desegregation. So they said, we're going to bus kids, put them on buses for 2 hours to go wherever they had to go. That was the value system there to do that. The question for us is, what are those value systems? And if we are making any changes to that, what are the things we're going to change? Because I do believe in integration of schools. I believe kids need to integrate more to be able to learn from each other and engage in our context of schools. I tell folks, in every city, we are one city. We are one Rochester. And so we have to be able to figure out how to do that. So if that's the strategy, that would be my approach. But to answer your question, it'd be something I'd have to assess and see. And we would be clear about our strategic plan, which we would create, not just the school district, on how to go about doing that.
Okay. All right, this question is from a student. It says, what changes, if any, would you bring to the Rochester City School District?
I think that's a wide question. So let me say things that I know we have to do. We have to make sure that we address the Aquino report, the Distinguished Educator report. In that report, it's pretty much, quite frankly, is our best practices. They're not like great innovative things. It's just best practices. Some of those things that are in that report for best practices have to do with, one, how we are governing ourselves, the governance; two, how we're organizationally set up; three, how we're really focusing on the values of student achievement, what those things are, and what's very clear, at least from my perspective, is that the district needs to have a clear strategic plan, which is a roadmap that says, here's what we believe that all kids at the 3rd grade should do, 6th grade, 9th grade, or here's how we think our community should function. And we then should invest in those markers to move that. And then there should be a clear platform for you as the community to see whether we're making progress on those indicators or not. And that's what I would say is what we have to focus on. When we came to Nashville, we had to work on a strategic plan. One of the things we've done is we went out to 17 listen and learn communities and did what they call listen and learns, and wrote up what each of those communities wanted in their city, and we made our adjustments and bringing communities, schools, and different stakeholders, teachers, and different groups at the table to create a strategic plan for 5 years for the school system. And now we invest based on what's in our strategic plan. And so we have to really be clear about that roadmap. And once we have that, it will take care of a lot of these other issues that you see in that Aquino report.
Okay. So this next question is from an audience member. It says, how would you get central office to effectively communicate with teachers, new departments, new programs, new parent programs?
So communication is one of the hardest challenges in school districts, especially larger districts. And so one of the strategies that we do is we over-communicate. We have a process we call Principal Connection, where we send out information every Wednesday to all schools. One initiative we were thinking about also doing is what they call a Teacher Connection, where we're also sending out everything to schools. We're also working with our collective bargaining units to make sure that we're all messaging some of those same pieces. And so that's kind of how we think about that work. Also going out to schools, making sure that they constantly have communication in terms of communicating with their families, regardless of the type of communities. Doing that also in different sets of languages, making sure that here are the things that we value. And I would tell folks the biggest component is keeping things simple. It doesn't need to be a dissertation. It could be 3 bullets. I mean, whatever that is, it has to connect with those spaces. In my current experiences, I learned that I've worked in districts in Boston and in Pittsburgh and Prince George's County, where we've learned that you had different communities that communicated in different ways. And so we not only had to communicate as a school district, but we had to also communicate with all our external partners to make sure they're on the same page about here's what the district's trying to do and here's what we're doing. And we, in transparency, we tell people transparency equals trust. The more people feel that you're transparent and they say, oh, you did exactly what you said you're going to do, the more they build trust with you, and that's our approach. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. So what is your experience with poverty, high crime rates, and low graduation rates? And what will you implement to address those 3 dynamics for students to succeed in the Rochester City School District? Now, this is from a community member.
So I've worked in many school districts. Some are like high poverty, and some have, every district I've worked in at least had, I want to say, at least 45 to 50% poverty level, and they had urban areas. And so my experience have been is that wraparound services and in connecting with other agencies help you resolve issues. Currently in Nashville, we have very high crime rate in a particular zip code. As a matter of fact, the Brookings Institute wrote about that zip code. They said if any child lives in that community, they have an 85% chance of not graduating. And that is one of the alarming things for us. And so what we have done is partnered with the mayor's office and agencies to be able to provide additional resources and targeted support to make sure that we're able to connect with them so the folks who grow up in that particular community can be able to do well. And that means sometimes us allocating more funding to them for different group of things, because we do not believe, or I can tell you, I do not believe equity means the same. Equity means that we align resources to needs. And so that may mean moving dollars in specific ways to particular communities so you can kind of solve problems and gaps in those areas. And so the more that you're able to keep kids engaged in school like we have, the more you'll see the crime rate go down. The more you have kids out of school and they're not connected to school and they're not doing well, the more you'll see crime rate go up. In my experiences, that has been that work. So I have worked in districts that dealt a lot of that, but you cannot, in where we are currently right now around poverty, crime, and all these issues, we have to think about specific wraparound services that are tailored to specific schools so we can drop the crime rate, and they're all interconnected.
Okay. So this question is from one of the audience members. It says, it has been stated that the district has a large budget deficit. What are your plans to close the gap?
So there's a couple of things. This current budget, I mean, you're hiring a new superintendent, so I'm going to most likely, if I was chosen as superintendent, I'm going to inherit this budget. But probably the strategy that I would do is I would probably more likely go in and sit with the interim and the team and be able to look at where the spending is. Currently, right now, in the current district I'm in, we have 86,000 students, and we have the same budget as Rochester. We spend about $940 million, which means we're paying $10,300 per kid, right? Now, the cost here is a little bit high, is much higher. There's a lot of different premiums and a lot of pieces around that. But what I would say to you, the only reason I bring up that comparison is not to say that there's one better than the other, is to say to you is that we have to be very strategic about how we're spending our money and what we're spending it on. And we have to organize ourselves effectively in that way. You cannot be spending on everything. You have to be able to focus on one or two things or three things per year. So if you focus on those things every single year, if you say I'm focusing on 2 things per year, in 3 years, that means you should be doing 6 things really well, right? And so a part of the strategic plan and working through those components has to be around that. And I would be working through with the board around what that means, what their values are around that, because the budget is a public trust between the community and the board. And our job is to kind of work through that. And there's a lot of good things that are actually, I would tell you, that are happening in the city in terms of moving that work. We would just need to make sure that we can capitalize on keeping those good things going and then kind of narrow our focus in terms of the area we need to focus on. In Nashville, we only focus on 3 things when we think about our work right now is the suspension rates, literacy, and chronic absenteeism. And we align if we're going to make allocation of costs, we try to allocate them within that space of strategic plan. Budgets, there's only 3 things that you work on in a budget. Budget is money, time, and people. And so you get the money, you allocate time to move that resource or whatever the marker is, and then you can move people around to galvanize to solve that issue.
Oh, that sounds great. So my next question is from a staff member. It says, it's a 2-part question. Do you speak Spanish? And what are your intentions towards the Spanish-speaking community in Rochester?
Habla español un poquito. Mi esposa es de El Salvador. I know Spanish just a little bit. My wife is from El Salvador. So as you can imagine, if I want to eat food at my in-laws' house, I have to get my Spanish up. But I also speak Creole. Oui, parle Creole, because I grew up speaking that language. Et je parle français aussi. I also speak French. And so I'm very sensitive to communities that speak different languages because I grew up in those type of communities. And so my goal is for every child, not just only kids who speak Spanish, but to make sure they feel a part of the school system and that we as Rochester are moving that work together forward.
Okay. So the next question is from an audience member. It says, can you tell us more about your financial plans within the first 100 days?
The financial plan, so I'm gonna clarify, so I'm assuming that's the budget.
That includes layoffs and reduction in staff, just as the financial plan.
I anticipated this question. So again, I have not seen the budget in detail, so it's hard for me to come in and say to you outside of what I've seen in papers or what I've seen on video about the budget. Here's what I do know. As I give the interim superintendent and also the board around trying to address, we have to be able to move the needle on issues as we're simultaneously making sure that our reserves are not, we don't have any money in our reserves, right? Which means that there's a lot of different things that you look at. How do you target your focus around that? How do you look at what's in your strategic plan? One of the things I would say is coming in year one is I would really work with the board for us to make sure that we have clarity around our strategic plan, because that's our roadmap for at least the next 3 to 5 years. So when we get to these budget talks and we get to those components, we can figure out making sure that we're aligning our money and our organization towards those pieces. And so we're not just talking about people, but we're talking about what we are doing that can actually help support children around the work. To me, the budget's always about children first and everything second. And a part of that is for us to move all the children in our school system to have high quality education.
Okay. So the next question is from a parent. It says, what about the Rochester City School District interests you enough to want to relocate?
Yes, so I have worked in many school districts, especially urban. I am biased to that, I tell folks. And I believe that I have the skill sets to do this job, especially where Rochester is right now. We have a report that we have to work on. We have organizational efficiencies, all these other components. And although I've had to move around because of recruited or promoted and those pieces, I would tell you that I would not be sitting in front of you today if I didn't go through those experiences to be able to be in this seat. What I think is really important, though, is consistency. And consistency is if I do come to Rochester, you should expect that I'm committed to staying here. One of the factors that are the biggest challenge in districts is when you come to a district and you leave in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. And so for me, what's really important is that there's consistency. I shared this in the other room saying, you know, Rochester, coming in from an outside perspective, foundationally has done a lot of things. There's a lot to be proud of about this city. I was going to say our city. I'm hopeful to be our city, but you know, this is a city where you have abolitionists that came from here. The women's movement started here. You have a lot of great educators that came around here, that people right around across the country. I mean, so there's a lot of foundational pieces here. What we have to do is keep building on that and keep building on a lot of that good work, but that takes time. You know, so my hope is if I'm chosen as a superintendent over a period of time that, you know, whenever my tenure would be done, that you would say, you know, this superintendent, you saw him in the groceries, you saw him in the community he was building. I will be living in the city of Rochester with my family. And so my goal is to make sure that we are here together doing this work.
Okay. So I have another question. This is from an audience member. It says, how will you deal with the fact that the district has a challenge with having enough certified bilingual and special education educators?
So I don't know what the exact numbers are, but what I do know is we have to figure out different ways to make sure that we can get people certified. So let me give you a concrete example and a strategy that we're doing in the current district I'm in. Currently in Nashville, just like many urban districts or districts across the country, there are not many minority teachers in the classroom. Most of your teachers are white, and they're mostly white female. And what we ended up finding out was when we tried to work with the universities to recruit more teachers of color or bilinguals or whatever the category was, we tried to work through the universities. Some did a great job recruiting teachers and some did not. But what we looked at were who are our paraprofessionals in the classroom and all these support staff, and guess what? They were all what? Teachers of color, or they were bilinguals, or they were all, and so we said, well, how do we create a pipeline with the university to get them certified to be a part of the school district because they're already there, they're already experiencing those pieces. So we are currently working on that process with university to see how we can invest in them so they can stay in the school system. They're from here, they're used to the system, and so that's one of the strategies that we're using around doing that work. So that would be something I would look into, resolve the bilingual issue and those other components. I know that there are many, with what happened in Puerto Rico, you have many people that moved here. I know there's different groups of folks that are in Rochester, so we have to figure out how we can build that bridge and work with our universities to be able to have them become a part of our school system.
Oh, that sounds great. So the next question, this is from a community member. It says, what are your thoughts about summer learning loss? And what would you do as the superintendent about that?
Yeah, so that's a big issue, not just the Rochester City School District issue, especially when you have children of color, kids coming from poverty. One of the things that I could tell you currently in the district that I'm in, we actually expanded on summer camps, and we also expanded on summer school. We worked with different sets of groups to do that partnership, and it was very costly to tell you. So, but we think about summer school in two ways, not only for remediation, but also for enrichment, because we tell people you will not remediate yourself to success. And so providing kids with that opportunity to be in those environments, to be able to constantly learn throughout the summer is important. And we've also worked with some agencies to make sure that we're sharing data so they can know how kids are performing, so they can be able to help us support. And so that's a strategy that I would do here. So to answer your question, I'm a huge believer that summer loss happens, and if I became the superintendent in Rochester, I'd be looking to expand that. And that would be one of our markers that we would have also in our strategic plan.
Okay. So this question is from someone in the audience. They say hi.
Hello?
What will you do to make sure a student marked absent at the beginning of the day because they came to school late, they are in school, but the mother was called stating the child is not in school? So it says
So
that.
they're in school, but the mother's saying that the child is not in school? Or
Well,
the
it
mother got a call saying that the child...
Yes, so
Yes.
apparently they were told that the student came in late and the parent was never told that they actually came in later.
So as I shared with the board, part of my entry plan is under 5 areas: governance, operational efficiencies, student achievement, family and community support. And so this to me would be under the operational space. I would come in doing an audit on how we do our systems work, how we do all these components, and if those pieces are discovered, and I also look at it as we compare to the report that the distinguished educator gave, and then that to me sounds like it's more of a systems issue, right? So whatever that system that is used, usually in schools, when a child is marked absent, there's a trigger that happens in the system that an automatic robocall would be made to a parent. So if that's happening and that's not seen, that could be a problem. The other thing too is making sure you're taking attendance day by day, where in some programs you can do that, and so it can kind of figure out if a kid's even cutting class or whatever that component. So I would look, that sounds more of an operational issue to me, and so we would look at that to see where those challenges are so we can kind of problem solve that. And I would assume that that's a operational fix.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from a parent. It says, how important to you are community ideas and parent community input into district decision-making?
Yeah, so I tell folks, I wrote my dissertation on school community partnership. I'm a huge believer in communities being engaged and involved. But I also believe that we have to be clear about where the community decision-making is. I think that you work with the community to get through all the components as it aligns to how you're working through the each elements of whatever that issue is. But we have to also be clear that we have a wide range of communities, and so our job is to be transparent and work through various integrated task force with making sure different sets of community members are working through different sets of issues when it comes to the district level, so we can make an informed decision that our entire Rochester City School District community can accept and move forward in. And so I'm a big believer in the community being a part of that process. In terms of that community making the sole decision, there are various communities in Rochester, like there are various communities in all the other districts I lived in, and so we just have to be clear that if it's a policy decision, it doesn't impact only one community, it impacts the entire community. So it would have to be a conversation that we're clear with the board on how we will go about that.
Okay. So this question is from one of the audience members. It says, please describe the development of wraparound services for students, parents, schools, and community agencies you found to be most successful.
Yeah, so currently there's a model that we do in Nashville that I would really say was really strong. I've seen a really good model in Nashville, which is called the Community Achieves model. I've also seen a model in Boston Public Schools that done really well. But the elements are still the same. It has elements that deal with not only referring children to various community issues, like you go to wraparound services, but you also add a health and wellness part of the wraparound services that can engage in areas where children are having health issues and those components. I've also seen where the 4 factors that I would say that we looked at is one that is a community engagement, where there is community engagement by various community stakeholders in that group. 2, it has a health and wellness component in it. And 3, it also has a component where you are soliciting government agencies to help you problem solve particular areas in the city, because every problem comes with funding, and you have to kind of be very targeted with specific areas in the community, and also engaging nonprofit communities, nonprofit partners in that process. There are some community partners that are more impactful than others in particular communities, and so making sure they're part of that wraparound service approach.
Okay. So this question is from a community member. It says, what has your support of school arts programs looked like in previous districts?
Yeah, so I'm a huge believer in the school and arts. I think that you can't just do academics alone. So I tell folks that's an important value to me. Currently in Nashville, we're known as Music City. So you can imagine that School of the Arts are a part of that. We actually get funding from the Grammy Foundation, which I would be pushing for us to get if I became the superintendent here. But we get external funding from different foundations to make sure that we have arts, music, and various other components to be in the school system. I also believe in maximizing your community partners. There are different partners in different communities that you can bring in to also supplement a lot of that. Again, I know my goal is to become the superintendent here in Rochester, so I'd be very involved in the community, but there's a lot of rich resources that are here in Rochester that you can maximize. A lot of the school districts I've been in that have done it well, they have been able to maximize local talent and local community partnerships to be in schools, and so that would be my approach on increasing that work here.
Okay. So this is a question from someone in the audience. It says, what is your plan for including leaders already in the district on moving the district forward?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that you have to be able to bring leaders and being a part of the process here. I have been in school districts where I've seen people bring external folks in. I've seen where they've promoted internal. I think you have to think about that as a whole. I think as a superintendent, you have to think about the organization. So I'm a big believer on making sure that we can promote from within for opportunities, but I'm also a big believer that we have to be able to structure for that to happen, to make sure that we have enough talent to make sure that we can accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish in the system. And sometimes, you want to mix external and internal candidates that have those expertise to be able to do that. And so I just think it's a combination of that. That's just how I think about our work. I mean, Rochester has a lot of talent around a lot of the work, And so you just maximize internal. But I also think there's a lot of things we can also bring to our city to even move our work forward. And so you just kind of have to do that in a combination.
Okay. So this is a question from a parent. It says, it is noted that each of you have held positions in a number of communities throughout your career. Rochester is in need of a consistent leadership, particularly in the superintendent role. How are we as a community to trust that you will remain committed to this post?
Yeah, I was sharing this earlier. I would not be here if I wasn't trying to be here for a while. I have had to be in other districts because that's how I had opportunities to learn how to just be able to sit in front of you today to do this work. Consistency is important. I was sharing in the other room, I think of Rochester as, you know, a foundation that you have, and you have to build on that house. And so my commitment to everyone here, and as you would hear me today, because you will have this on videotape, if I become the superintendent of Rochester, you can expect me to be here for a while. And because it's important that in order for us to do this work, you will need a superintendent to be here consistently over a number of years. So that will mean that as we move the work forward, you may not like every decision I may make, but that means we have to always move together to be able to build not only with the board, but also as a school system for us to be successful. Districts that have been the most successful in urban districts have had a superintendent consistently there for a number of years. And that would be my commitment to you. My wife is here with me. We would be here. We're already looking around the neighborhoods and communities. And so you will see me at the grocery store. I will live in Rochester City. You will see me at church, you know, and so I will become a part of this community. And that is my commitment to you.
That sounds great. So the next question is from someone in the audience. It says, what is your instructional vision to maximize teaching and learning for general education, ELLS, and special education students?
Yeah, so I believe in having what they call a teaching and learning framework. So I'm believing this thing called my values around what we call the instructional core. And a part of the instructional core is you have to focus on students, teachers, and high quality content. If you're only focusing on one and not all three together, you have a challenge. So if you have, when you're focusing on students, you're providing enough wraparound services for them to do their work. If you focus on teachers, you're providing not only with the tools, but professional development for them to do better. And then you have to have what they call high quality content. There is a report that came out from a group called TNTP that wrote an article called The Opportunity Myth. And pretty much what it boils down to, it says that teachers are teaching harder, but the curriculum that they have, the curriculum or the materials that they have in front of kids are very low level. And so we have to be able to work on making sure that we have high quality curriculum and to be able to kind of work through that. And so my approach has always been, those are the three areas. If you're working on one without the other, you're missing. So an example, I will tell somebody, if you said, we have to move literacy to improve our reading scores, but we're just gonna hire more reading teachers without having a high quality curriculum for those reading teachers to work from, you're not going to improve it, right? So this is why I say to you, when I come to my entry plan, you have to be able to look at operationally what you can work on, because we have to only focus on one or two things so we can build over time.
Okay, so this next question is from a community member. It says, New York State's next generation standards have identified play as an important component to developmentally appropriate teaching and learning, especially for grades pre-kindergarten through third. What has been your experience with supporting playful learning in your past positions? If selected, how would you support teachers and administrators in using play in Rochester City School District classrooms?
So currently in Nashville, we use the play model only. It's an instructional strategy for those of you that may not know, but we only use that for pre-K kids, pre-K students. We do not use it at kindergarten 1, 2, and 3. We use other strategies such as, we call them core actions, where you work with a child around text, talk, and then task. And so as you work through each of those areas, you can now strategize on building children's capacity around reading a text, talking about the text, and doing something. And so but it brings some of the same elements that play does. And the model of play is where you allow, in Nashville, we have a constructivist approach, where a child can go in and learn about play on their own, and they kind of drive their learning and the teacher's supporting. But the elements are kind of the same when you look at collaboration, social motor skills, and all these components. And so that's kind of how we address that work from an academic standpoint. And so if the standards are saying that that's what they're doing from K to 3, we would have to take a look at that. But I do believe that the instructional strategies that I've seen as you gradually go up from pre-K up is around things such as being able to read complex texts, learn, provide evidence on what you're reading. And so some of those strategies, you have to put some guardrails that kids should be able to do that. So that's kind of how we think about that work. But the play strategy is a very good strategy. I would have no problem supporting that. I would just want to see a combination of making sure that we can make sure that kids are academically hitting their targets. And so I think as you move up the grades, you have to be able to also include specific curriculum guidelines around that.
Okay. So this next question is from someone in the audience. It says, have you evaluated the varied academic, social problems in this district? And this is the second question. What is the greatest problem that you will address first to bring cohesion to the district?
Yeah, so yes, I looked at the report. I've also looked at a lot of the data that's been in the district, and I would tell folks that this district is very similar to many urban districts across the country, having a set of challenges. The 3 areas that I would look at immediately to begin to work on is, one, is we have to have a teaching and learning framework that we're clear about what we're going to teach at what grade level. 2, we have to make sure that we're organized in a way to make sure that we can be able to make sure that children are reading all at grade level and hitting the standards. And the third piece I would definitely look at that I would want to happen in the first year is that the district, we are creating a strategic plan, which is a roadmap on how we're going to get there. Because once we have the strategic plan as a roadmap, it will help us in deciding on how we are going to spend our money, how we're going to accelerate or look at the gaps that we have if we have children that cannot read or whatever those gaps are. And it also helps you around functioning operationally as a system. So those would be the big 3 that I would walk in looking at. But that would be a part of my 100-day entry plan. Once I would come in and looking at the 5 areas I mentioned before in the 100-day entry plan, I would give a report out to the city, I would say, not just only the board, but we'd be able to say, okay, here's how we're going to address those issues.
Okay. So this question is from a parent. It says, literacy learning has been a concern in the district for many years. Most programs used do not provide adequate time on text, authentication, use of children's literature for writing real purposes. What has your experience been in ensuring that the needs to all students are met? What types of support have you provided to ensure teachers are able to provide developmental, appropriate, and balanced literature, especially in grades K to 3? How will you support the high literacy needs in our community?
And so we've had the same challenge in the current district I'm in. We created a literacy blueprint plan across the city. One of the clear things is that we worked on making sure that we can align what we call a scope and sequence. And I know we're getting very technical for the community, but it's an alignment of making sure that we're clear about what kids should be able to do at each grade level, specifically around reading. And then you provide, we're clear that we have, when we talked about the instructional core, which is teacher-student content, we're making sure that we're working on each of those elements to be able to improve on those areas. One, in my current district, what we have done is once we were able to create the blueprint plan for literacy, we added additional coaches to support teachers in classrooms. We call them like many chief academic officers. They're called literacy teacher development specialists, and they work with teachers in their planning time and with the principal around a literacy strategy plan to work in the schools. And then we are able to scaffold accordingly. So when teachers are sitting down planning around specific lessons or specific areas in the lessons that they're teaching, they're clear about what strategies that they're using around the school. We also focus on what they call ELA core, three ELA core actions. I'm a little tongue-tied. ELA core actions, and those ELA core actions are what we call the text, talk, and task, trying to make sure that kids are able to do that in every lesson that they're doing, whether it's around math, whether it's around English, whether it's around science. The challenge that we have with children around reading is what the achievement gap is. So I tell folks the literacy gap is the achievement gap in the United States. And that achievement gap is why we have an opportunity gap. If kids cannot read and write first, they cannot accomplish anything. And that becomes actually the predictor for getting kids to become successful. And that's a very huge challenge when it comes down to children of color, especially around poverty. And so we have to put a lot of not only interventions in place, but teach them at a high level. You will never remediate yourself to success, I tell folks. And so we have to keep high quality instruction for kids.
Okay. So this question is from someone in the audience. It says, you mentioned that you are ready to build on the good things already going on in Rochester. You never mentioned the leaders who have seen the Rochester City School District for many years, a number of whom have trusted the success. What is your plan for building on and sustaining their work in the Rochester City School District?
So I think it's a great question. If I was in their position, I'd be asking the same question. Because again, this district has gone through a lot of transition, especially at this level. Here's what we have done. I could tell you on how I've built bridges around the principals, because I govern all of the principals in the schools in the city of Nashville. I have done what they call principal roundtables, where I bring a group of principals by, we do it by quadrants. Quadrants are 4 areas, and there are about 30 to 40 principals per quadrant. As you know, we have 100 semi-schools in Nashville. And what I have done is, in those roundtables, I've always asked the same 6 questions. What's getting in the way of your job? What can we do better to support you? How do you want us to communicate? And what is your biggest headache? I usually have a question like that in there. And in these roundtables, we would do them 3 times a year. Usually we do them when we start off in the beginning of the year, and we rotate through all of our principals, and then they would give us a list of things within those categories. And then we would group and organize them, and then we would make changes to those things so we can help them from an efficiency standpoint. And so that's how I would address that work if I became the superintendent. I would be using a protocol like that. I believe it's important that the people who are closer to the people who are closer to the work need to be the ones you listen to the most, so you can have change. Because change, you're able to change things with people who are closer to the work. So working by making sure we create opportunities to hear principals. In Nashville, we have what they call a teacher council, creating opportunities to meet with teachers, and it could be by particular communities. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can do that, but I would be doing that in that space. And when I sit in that group where we're usually meeting, it's myself and the, it could be the chief academic officer or the other operational people, so they can also hear what's happening on the ground, so we can be much more efficient on how we make the changes.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions for you. This is from a parent. It says, parents in the Rochester City School District get lip service. They are told they are welcome in schools, but in fact they are not. They are not respected by teachers or administrators. The only way for parents to advocate is through the law or the media. How do you propose to include parents, to support parents, and to help teachers and administrators understand the value of truly welcoming parents, caregivers, and families into the classroom?
So first, I tell folks it's important that customer service is an important piece, but we need to make that public. Here's what we believe in: having a welcoming front office when you walk in, teachers working with parents as our partners, inviting people to be clear about what goes on in our schools. And the strategy that we use a lot is trying to make sure that we're very public about those pieces. And then there's elements that you can push on from an accountability perspective around looking at school improvement plans, because principals at times, there's a section in there where they talk about school culture and climate, or how you're going to engage with your parents, and we keep them accountable to those areas. Other things as well is making sure that as we're providing, looking at from an accountability standpoint, we're also providing supports for folks who don't know how to do that. You know, that's always another area. And then also trying to do targeted support for schools where that's a very huge challenge. So if we get in our data and it says, you know, if parents do not feel that they're welcome or they're engaging or anything like that, then we can provide targeted services to that school and say, you know, let's work now, how do we improve that, so we can kind of work through those. And constantly giving parents surveys. One of the things that we wanted in the current district I'm in, we've been moving towards is not only providing, first is asking less questions, because we want to have a higher return rate. If you ask parents 25 questions and you only have 10% responding to you, you're not getting the answer you want in the survey. So we've looked at a different strategy around doing also focus groups, where we ask a current group of parents to come in and say, hey, what do you think about the school? How do you do those? And then we capture that data and work with the school around those components. And so those would be kind of the strategies I would bring to Rochester.
Okay, so this question is from someone in the audience. This is the last question. It says, Oprah Winfrey suggested that we are asking the wrong questions. We ask, what's wrong with you, rather than what happened to you. How do you help staff to understand wanting and considering control circumstances?
Yeah, so the challenge, so just like any school district, the challenge, at least in the experiences I've had, has never been about the what. You'll hear if you talk to a number of people, everybody believes kids should learn. The challenge has always been about the how. How do we go about it? And I would argue that's the same challenge you see when you see the relationship between a superintendent and the board or different stakeholders throughout the city. I think what we have to come to an agreement on is what's the common way of going around the how. And once we work through those things, we stick to it over time, and we measure it, and we go through that process. And so to what Oprah Winfrey says about that comment, I mean, when she talks about the happen, she's talking about the how. And one of the toughest things around these jobs is because when you're in a district that is diverse and there's so many different sets of stakeholders, you have to be able to over-communicate and get everybody on the same page about this is how we're going to approach the work. And that's why I bring up again to say we have to answer questions. We have to be able to focus the district on 1 to 2 things over time, because the how is so hard as it is. So if you do, I tell people 1 goal is a goal, 2 goals is a half a goal, 3 goals is no goals at all. And so you have to be able to focus on 1 or 2 things and then work through those pieces so you're building quality over time. We have a huge opportunity as a district where we in Rochester can really build quality. And that will mean a lot of accountability work, but also a lot of support, and also about a lot of truths about how we're going to go about the work and sticking to that how, even if we don't see it moving in the fastest rate. But our strategic plan and all other components will keep us aligned on doing that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.